You are listening to PT on Ice, The Older Adult, a collaboration between the Senior Rehab Project and the Institute of Clinical Excellence. This is a rebroadcast of an original episode that can be found at ptonice.com.
Hi everyone, Christina Novak back talking with you about the proper management of older adults. Over the last couple of weeks, my partner Dustin and I have been trying to talk about this reframing of the older adult and what we think about when we think about the aging adult and what it means to age healthily or age successfully. And so I thought today I would talk about the opposite end of that spectrum. And I'm going to apologize in advance. We actually have one of our classes going on in the background. So if you hear any music going on, that is what it is going on. It's always really exciting in our gym. Okay, so today I thought that we would talk a little bit about what it means to be frail. And I think as clinicians, we have this idea in our mind about what the frail older person is, the frail older gentleman or the frail older lady. And it's kind of hard to put this into words because we have this picture that comes up in our minds, but what does that really mean? And in the research realm, this is actually a really contentious issue because trying to hone in on a definition of frailty can be really difficult. And so what we've kind of decided is, I'm sorry, my dogs are totally going after a squirrel. Okay, and so what we've kind of decided on the frailty spectrum is that we kind of conceptualize frailty as a vulnerability to external stressors. And this is kind of a catch-all definition. And it doesn't only talk about the physical dimension, but we actually have research to support that we are in subclinical positions across multiple organ systems. And so frailty has been defined as a clinical geriatric syndrome. So this is a person who is not along the normal aging continuum, is somebody who is starting to experience a lot of different issues. Often these are the individuals we see in our clinic that have a complex medical history, have abnormal blood work, and are starting to have these issues creep up and affect their day-to-day life. And so when we are thinking about this as clinicians, there are a couple of different ways that researchers have tried to kind of think about frailty. And as physiotherapists, we are constantly kind of thinking in the physical dimension. So I'm going to start there first. And the reason why this is important is because people who are seen as frail have worse outcomes in a wide range of health markers. So people who are frail are more likely to be institutionalized, are more likely to be hospitalized, are at increased risk of falls, increased risk of adverse events, delayed healing, increased risks of death. So all of these negative health outcomes. So understanding where these people that we are seeing lie on a frailty continuum is going to be really important. Okay, from a research perspective, there are kind of three big ways that researchers try to conceptualize frailty, and I'm going to try and go through each one for you so that you kind of have an understanding when this comes up in the literature or when people are starting to talk about frailty, where they may be coming from. As physical therapists, we tend to focus on the Freed physical phenotype. And so this was made popular by Linda Freed back in 1991. And what she developed was 5 physical characteristics that we can start to see in our clinic. And if people have 3 or more of these physical characteristics, then we would deem them as frail. If they have one or two of these characteristics, they would be seen as pre-frail. And if they had zero, they would be considered robust or in kind of that healthy aging continuum. Okay, these 5 physical characteristics are low physical activity, low energy or fatigue, slow gait speed, which we've seen in the past is one of the 6 vital signs, low muscular strength, and unexplained weight loss. The 5th one, unexplained weight loss, geriatricians that I've worked with have said, they're already along this really hard path. It's really hard to get them back if that is one of the criteria that they are presenting with. But needless to say, these are one of the 5 criteria. So that's kind of a very physical-centric definition of frailty. A second one that's really popular, especially in a hospital setting, it was made popular by Kenneth Rockwood around the same time that Linda Fried was bringing these definitions into popular research culture. And Ken Rockwood is actually a fellow Canadian, which is super exciting. And his is a little bit more medical. So he has 2 scales. He has the frailty index and the clinical frailty scale. And both are extremely different, but have been shown to have some links and good responsiveness between the two. The frailty index is using the person's medical record to essentially do a cumulative count of the issues that they have. And what a lot of people like about the frailty index is that it doesn't matter what is on this medical record. As long as there's over 20, 30 plus items, then it's shown to have the same validity. What I mean by that is if one medical record asks about things like high blood pressure, hypertension, but then asks about little like dementia and another medical record doesn't, that doesn't mean that one is more valid than the other. It just means that the items that you're starting to control for are slightly different. The thing about the Rockwood Index is that it has had the same links to adverse outcomes in different hospital settings, and people like it because you're already starting to collect that information around past medical history when people are admitted into hospital. So you can kind of track it over time. What's really important with the frailty index is that we also have physical measures. So asking about self-reported issues with different activities of daily living and IADLs. And if they report difficulty with any of these, this would be a similar check mark as having an issue, kind of the same as if somebody had high blood pressure. So issues with toileting would count as a 1 point, and having high hypertension would be 1 point. And then you would sum the amount of impairments or illnesses that a person has and put it over the total number of things that you asked about. So you have this cumulative index that you're creating, and there isn't actually a cutoff score. Sometimes they say 0.25 is considered a cutoff score for frailty, but the idea is that the higher this score is, the worse we are kind of expecting, or the worst prognosis a person may have. When the frailty index started to become popular, some people said, this is kind of cumbersome. This is a lot of work to do this frailty index, even though we're starting to have logarithms and things that will calculate it automatically on admission. And so they started to say, I don't need a medical score. I don't need an index. I know when a person is walking into my room if they are frail or not. And so Ken Rockwood said, okay, well, let's see if that's true. And so he developed a 7-point clinical frailty scale where it was basically after initial exam, a clinician, which was first done with geriatricians and emergency room physicians, said, okay, well, let's mark them on a scale of 0 to 7, and 7 being more frail, and 0 to 1 being robust and normal functioning and doing very well. And let's see if this matches up with the frailty index. And so the research on this is still kind of new and coming out. It's been like less than 10 years that the clinical frailty scale has been going through studies for validation. But we are starting to see that clinicians have a pretty good idea about a person's function, irrespective of having a frailty index or a composite score. And so for some hospitals, they will have a note on their medical record that says CFS, or clinical frailty scale. And it's the idea that clinicians are starting to label individuals across this scale because it's so important in terms of understanding people's outcomes and what to expect from people as they transition out of hospital or as they're going through an acute episode of some medical flare-up. So Ken Rockwood's work tends to focus in kind of the medical domain. And in terms of what physiotherapists or how accurate physiotherapists are, there still isn't a lot of work in the research space because it has focused so much on the physician up to this point. But I'm hoping that soon, I think physios can be just as accurate in terms of trying to mark level of frailty. So we'll see how it goes. Okay, so the third one that tends to be really popular, and I'm less familiar with this one because I don't use it as much in my research, is the Tilburg Frailty Index. And the reason why I wanted to mention this one is because one of the big drawbacks, or one of the things that people are really saying is a negative to a lot of the frailty definitions, is that we are focusing on just the physical domain. And so the Tilburg Frailty Index adds the psychological and the social domains that has a little bit more biopsychosocial context and asks different questions. I believe it's self-report on each of these three domains. And so some clinicians prefer the Tilburg Frailty Index because it kind of gives you a little bit more of an idea about environmental supports and social supports when you're talking to an individual and trying to classify them across the frailty continuum, because some people may argue that this vulnerability gets exposed more for an individual who doesn't have those supports versus a person that does. So those are kind of the three. We have the Freed physical phenotypes, and there actually are defined physical tests around usual gait speed and grip strength that we use to operationalize those definitions. We have the Rockwood Frailty Index and Clinical Frailty Scale and the Tilburg Frailty Indicator. So TFI is the name of that test. And as I talk about the Tilburg test in particular, there has been this shift that's happened in the frailty literature because the definition of frailty is so broad and talks about this vulnerability. With the rise of cognitive issues and dementia happening in our aging population, there's almost been this dichotomy that's happened where people have separated frailty and started to express frailty as either physical frailty or cognitive frailty. And this is a hot topic in the frailty research realm because classically, frailty was not seen as something that was cognitive. Cognitive issues will definitely contribute to a person's physical frailty status. But there's been a rise in saying, you know, if frailty is considered a vulnerability to stressors, why isn't our cognitive capabilities a second issue, like another vulnerability that we need to consider? And underneath this umbrella, this clinical geriatric syndrome, and what can we do about it? And do we need separate definitions? And is one definition just as good as the other? Can we do a physical characterization as well as a cognitive characterization, and are we getting better results? And these are still some of the questions that we're trying to figure out, and some of the things that as clinicians who are working with older adults, understanding where a person is at cognitively is so important to our course of care and our exercise prescription and their ability to get to our appointments, that I think that it's something that it's really important for us to consider as well. All right. That is it for today. I hope that you guys found that useful. If you have any questions about those definitions, let me know. My research focuses on the freed frailty scale, but I do have some familiarity with the other scales if you guys are looking at incorporating some of that into your clinical practice, which I hope that you do because it's really important to some of our outcomes. And as always, I will see you guys in a couple of weeks, and have a great day. Bye.
Hit me. Thank you for listening. And if you enjoyed this episode, go to ptonice.com, click on the courses tab, and check out Modern Management of the Older Adult. This is a course that myself and Christina Prevett are going to be teaching. It's 8 weeks, an online format, interactive, and solely focused on helping students change how they practice and how they work with older adults. For more information, just go to ptonice.com. Thanks.